NASA just announced plans to put astronauts back on the moon by 2028. The United States Senate passed legislation calling for a permanent lunar base by 2030. Headlines are screaming that humanity is about to become a multiplanetary species, but there is a word hiding inside every one of those announcements that nobody is questioning. Base. Not city. Not settlement. Not civilization. Base. Because there is an enormous difference between planting a flag and building a neighborhood, between surviving for 60 days and raising a child, between a research outpost supplied entirely from Earth and an independent community that feeds itself, powers itself, and governs itself, 240,000 miles from home. NASA can absolutely return humans to the moon. What NASA cannot do is build a city there. And the reasons why should change how you think about everything. If you are ready to understand why the moon is far harder to settle than almost anyone admits, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these deep dives into the real science behind the biggest space stories. Let's begin. Something extraordinary is happening right now. Not in a laboratory, not in a simulation. On a launch pad in Florida, a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty is being prepared to carry 4 human beings around the moon. Their names are Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. Glover will become the first person of color to reach deep space. Koch will become the first woman. Hansen will become the first non-American. They are real people with real training and a real mission called Artemis 2, targeting launch no earlier than April 2026. When that rocket ignites, it will produce 8.8 million pounds of thrust, more than any operational vehicle in history, and send its crew on a 10-day journey that loops behind the moon and returns to Earth at 25,000 miles per hour. This is not a concept. This is not a pitch deck. This is hardware bolted to a launch platform with astronauts in quarantine preparing to fly. And Artemis 2 is only the beginning. Behind it sits a sequence of missions escalating in ambition at a pace that would have seemed absurd a decade ago. Artemis 3, now scheduled for mid-2027, will test critical rendezvous and docking procedures in low Earth orbit, potentially involving one or both commercially developed lunar landers, the SpaceX Starship Human Landing System and Blue Origin's Blue Moon. Artemis 4, targeted for early 2028, is planned as the first crewed lunar landing since Eugene Cernan stepped off the surface in December 1972. After that, NASA intends to launch roughly 1 crewed lunar mission per year, building toward a sustained human presence at the moon's south pole. The agency's own timeline envisions a foundational surface habitat arriving in the early 2030s, stays of up to 180 days. Nuclear fission reactors providing continuous power through the 14-day lunar night, pressurized rovers for long-distance exploration, an orbital station called Gateway serving as a waypoint between Earth and the surface. Every piece of this architecture is being designed, contracted, and built right now by teams of engineers working across multiple continents. The pace of development behind the scenes is staggering. The Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit, the next-generation spacesuit designed for lunar surface operations, has passed internal reviews and is undergoing further evaluation by NASA, with assembly of the first flight unit underway. The European service module that powers the Orion spacecraft is on track for delivery. SpaceX has conducted multiple test flights of its Starship vehicle, iterating toward the orbital refueling capability required to send a fully loaded lander to the lunar surface. Blue Origin is building its Blue Moon lander under a separate contract to provide redundancy and competition. The power and propulsion element and habitation and logistics outpost, the first 2 modules of the Lunar Gateway, are in development with launch planned no earlier than 2027. Each of these components represents years of engineering effort and billions of dollars of investment converging toward a single objective: returning humans to the moon and keeping them there longer than Apollo ever imagined. The political machinery is moving just as fast. On March 4, 2026, the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation passed the NASA Authorization Act of 2026. The legislation explicitly directs NASA to establish a lunar surface moon base for the purpose of developing a permanent crewed United States presence on the moon. The bill's language calls for long-duration habitation, robotic and industrial operations, and the advancement of science, technology, and strategic interests. A White House executive order issued in December 2025 set a target of 2030 for initial base elements. Senator Ted Cruz, chairing the committee, framed the directive in terms that would have sounded like science fiction a generation ago. He said the United States must build a permanent moon base so that America gets there before China does. Senator Maria Cantwell, the committee's ranking member, echoed the urgency, emphasizing that the legislation supports a path forward that will get astronauts to the moon as soon as possible while establishing a program for a permanent outpost. A companion bill is circulating in the House. Funding is being allocated. The bureaucratic machinery of the world's most powerful government is grinding toward a goal that would have been dismissed as fantasy 15 years ago. China is not standing still. The China Manned Space Agency is targeting a crewed lunar landing no later than 2030. Its Long March 10 rocket and Lanyu lander have passed critical static fire and demonstration tests. China and Russia are jointly developing the International Lunar Research Station, a phased lunar outpost with its own architecture, its own timeline, and its own geopolitical logic. The station is designed to evolve from an initial robotic phase into a crewed facility capable of sustained operations. Unlike Artemis, which concentrates on the South Pole, the Chinese-Russian architecture envisions a broader footprint with potential for expansion across multiple surface locations. The competition is not abstract. Both nations are building flight hardware, both have committed public timelines. Both understand that whoever establishes a lasting presence on the moon first will shape the rules, the norms, and the strategic landscape of cislunar space for decades to come. Against this backdrop, the public narrative has crystallized into something powerful and seductive. We are going back. We are staying. We are building. The word that keeps appearing in headlines and legislation and press conferences is permanent. Permanent presence, permanent base, permanent habitation. And because the human imagination is exceptionally good at connecting dots that may not actually touch, the leap from permanent base to city feels small, natural, inevitable. If we can land astronauts, we can build a base. If we can build a base, we can expand it. If we can expand it, eventually it becomes a settlement. Eventually a town. Eventually, something that looks like the opening shot of every lunar colony in every science fiction film ever made. Domes on the horizon, streets under glass, children looking up at the Earth through skylights. The dream practically writes itself. And that dream is exactly where the problem begins, because there is a word embedded in every official document, every press release, every congressional authorization, every technical roadmap that almost nobody stops to examine. That word is base. Not city, not settlement, not colony, not community, base. And in the language of space engineering, base means something extremely specific. It means a facility, a workplace, a location where trained personnel rotate through on fixed schedules to perform defined tasks supported entirely by logistics from somewhere else. A base is to a city what a fire station is to the neighborhood it serves. Essential, functional, crude, but not a place where people live in the fullest sense of that word. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in the conversation about humanity's future on the moon. Because the gap between a base and a city is not a gap you can close with more funding, more launches, or more political will. It is a gap defined by physics, biology, economics, governance, and industrial capability. It is a gap so wide that confusing one side with the other leads to expectations that no agency, no nation, and no technology currently in development can meet. Let me make this concrete with 4 definitions that will anchor the rest of this story. The first tier is a crewed mission. This is a visit. Astronauts launch from Earth, travel to the Moon, perform tasks on the surface for a defined period, and return home. Apollo was this. Artemis 4 through roughly Artemis 7 will be this. Duration ranges from days to weeks. Everything the crew needs comes with them or is pre-positioned by robotic cargo deliveries. When the mission ends, the site may be abandoned entirely or left in standby mode awaiting the next visit. A crewed mission is camping. High-tech camping in the most extreme environment humans have ever entered. But camping nonetheless. You bring everything. You leave when supplies run low. You depend entirely on the vehicle that brought you for your ride home. The second tier is a lunar base. This is a workplace with infrastructure that persists between visits. Habitation modules remain on the surface. Power systems operate autonomously during the long lunar night. Rovers and scientific instruments continue functioning when no crew is present, collecting data, maintaining systems, awaiting the next rotation. But the base is not continuously occupied. Crews arrive, work, depart. The base waits. This is what the Artemis base camp concept describes. The foundational surface habitat. The pressurized rover for multi-week excursions. The unpressurized rover for local traversals. The surface power systems running on nuclear fission. Together they constitute a base. A very impressive base. A historically unprecedented base. But still a base. Still a workplace that shuts down between shifts. Even if the shifts last months and the workplace sits on another world. The third tier is a permanently inhabited outpost. This is a facility where at least some crew members are present at all times. The International Space Station is the closest analogy. It has been continuously occupied since November 2nd, 2000, over 25 years of uninterrupted human presence in low Earth orbit. Crew rotations ensure someone is always aboard. Life support systems recycle approximately 98% of the water supply. Resupply missions arrive regularly from Earth, carrying food, spare parts, experiments, and fresh crew. The outpost never shuts down. This is what the most ambitious long-term interpretations of Artemis eventually envision. A South Polar facility with overlapping crew rotations, uninterrupted operations, and long-duration stays of up to 6 months. Achieving this would be an extraordinary milestone. It would also still be entirely dependent on Earth for food, spare parts, medical support, crew replacement, and emergency evacuation. The crew would be government employees or contractors on assignment. They would serve tours and return home. Their families would remain on Earth. Their careers would continue on Earth. Their lives, in every meaningful sense, would be anchored to Earth. The fourth tier is a self-sustaining city. This is where the entire framework changes. A city is not a facility staffed by rotating specialists serving tours of duty. A city is a community. People live there permanently. Not for missions, not for rotations, permanently. They raise families, they educate children, they build careers that exist entirely within the city's economy. They grow food locally at agricultural scale. They manufacture goods locally from local resources. They generate energy locally with redundant systems capable of operating indefinitely. They govern themselves through local institutions with legal authority, courts, property rights, public services. They do not depend on resupply from Earth for survival. If the supply ship stopped coming, the city would endure. Not comfortably, not without hardship. But it would endure because it has the internal capacity to feed itself, shelter itself, power itself, repair itself, govern itself, and reproduce itself across generations. This fourth tier is what people imagine when they hear the phrase city on the moon. And this fourth tier is what no space agency on Earth is building, planning, funding, or architecting. Not because they have chosen not to, because the requirements are so far beyond current capability that they do not yet fit within any realistic engineering roadmap. The confusion between these tiers is not accidental. It is driven by language, by politics, and by the natural human tendency to see progress as a continuous escalator rather than a series of discrete cliffs. When a senator says permanent moon base, your brain hears the word permanent and fills in the rest. Permanent means lasting. Lasting means growing. Growing means city. The logic feels airtight. But it is not logic. It is narrative momentum. And narrative momentum has no obligation to respect engineering constraints. That narrative momentum is not generated by accident. It is manufactured, often unintentionally, by the visual and cultural language surrounding every lunar program announcement. When NASA releases concept art for the Artemis base camp, those images do not show a cramped 4-person module surrounded by barren regolith. They show sweeping panoramas of illuminated habitats, rovers traversing scenic ridgelines, astronauts working beneath soft interior lighting in spaces that look more like modern apartments than spacecraft cabins. The concept art for the foundational surface habitat depicts a structure that resembles a comfortable research lodge, not a survival capsule in a radiation-soaked vacuum. These images are produced for legitimate reasons. They communicate engineering intent, they inspire public support, they attract the next generation of scientists and engineers, but they also train the viewer to see the moon as a place where human life looks recognizably comfortable. The visual language erases the seals, the airlocks, the radiation monitors, the dust mitigation systems, the emergency pressure doors, and the ever-present awareness that a single failure could kill everyone inside. It replaces operational severity with architectural elegance. And once that replacement occurs in the public imagination, the mental distance between base and city shrinks to almost nothing. Science fiction completes the work that concept art begins. Decades of films, novels, television series, and video games have depicted lunar settlements as the natural first chapter of humanity's expansion into the solar system. In these stories, the moon base is always the beginning. It grows, it expands, it becomes a colony, then a city, then a spaceport, then a hub of interplanetary commerce. The narrative arc is always upward. The trajectory is always from small to large, from temporary to permanent, from outpost to civilization. This arc is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it functions as an unexamined assumption. Of course, a base becomes a city. That is what bases do in every story we have ever told about space. The possibility that a base might remain a base indefinitely, that it might serve its purpose brilliantly without ever growing into something larger, does not appear in the cultural script. It feels like failure even though it is not. It feels like stagnation even when it represents sustained, extraordinary achievement. The assumption that a base inevitably becomes a city is not a logical conclusion. It is a narrative reflex, and breaking free of it requires confronting the difference between how stories work and how engineering works. Consider the Artemis trajectory more carefully. Artemis 2 flies astronauts around the moon without landing. Artemis 3 tests docking procedures in Earth orbit. Artemis 4 attempts the first crewed landing in over 50 years, with 2 astronauts on the surface for approximately 1 week, while 2 remain aboard Orion in lunar orbit. Artemis 5 adds a second landing and begins constructing base camp elements. Artemis 8, projected for the early 2030s, is planned to deliver the foundational surface habitat and additional logistics. Artemis 10, tentatively planned for 2035, envisions astronauts staying on the moon long-term, with mission durations of up to 180 days. As of 2026, additional missions beyond Artemis 10 have not officially been discussed or detailed by NASA. The NASA Inspector General has stated that the current launch timeline is unrealistic and will likely be further delayed. The Government Accountability Office has reported that NASA has not established an official cost estimate for the Artemis 3 mission, let alone missions further down the manifest. So here is the honest trajectory. Across a span of roughly a decade, NASA plans to land small crews at the South Pole, build a habitat that can house 4 people, equip them with rovers, power systems, and basic scientific instruments, and work towards stays of several months. Every one of these milestones requires technology that is still being developed. The spacesuits are still being tested. The landers are still being built. The habitat exists as a concept with engineering studies, not a physical structure awaiting delivery. The nuclear surface reactor has not been manufactured. And even when all of this is complete, assuming no further delays, the result is a research station for 4 people, supported entirely by Earth, in one of the most hostile environments humans have ever attempted to occupy. 4 people, in a single habitat, dependent on resupply for every calorie, every litre of water, every replacement part, for stays of months, not lifetimes. This is the actual plan, and it is ambitious beyond anything that has been achieved since Apollo, but it is not a city. It is not close to a city. It is not on a path that leads to a city without a series of technological, economic, and institutional transformations so profound that they would represent revolutions in human capability comparable to the Industrial Revolution itself. The reason this distinction matters is that public discourse has collapsed all 4 tiers into a single narrative. People hear lunar base and think lunar city. They see a habitat module and imagine a neighborhood. They read about water ice extraction and picture farms. They hear permanent and assume generational. And this collapse of categories creates expectations that will inevitably collide with reality, generating either disillusionment or, worse, a loss of public support for the real and valuable work that NASA is actually doing. Because here is what makes this story so important to tell honestly. The things NASA is building are genuinely remarkable. Returning humans to the moon after more than half a century is a monumental achievement. Establishing a sustained research presence at the South Pole would be one of the most significant milestones in the history of human exploration. Developing nuclear surface power, testing in situ resource utilization, operating pressurized rovers across lunar terrain, conducting science in permanently shadowed craters where water ice has been locked away for billions of years. These are capabilities that will advance human knowledge and technology in ways that ripple outward to benefit life on Earth for generations. None of this should be diminished. None of this should be dismissed. But none of this should be confused with something it is not. The confusion is particularly dangerous because it distorts the public conversation about resources and expectations. If people believe NASA is building a city, they will judge the agency's progress against city-scale expectations. When those expectations are not met, because they cannot be met with the tools and budgets available, the resulting disappointment could erode political support for the programs that are actually achievable and genuinely worthwhile. The greatest threat to the real Artemis program is not a hydrogen leak on the launch pad. It is not a delayed heat shield. It is the gap between what the public expects and what the program was designed to deliver. Now, some will argue that this is exactly how progress works. Apollo started with a single landing and was supposed to lead to a permanent presence. The argument goes that if we just keep building, incrementally, mission by mission, the base will grow into a settlement and the settlement will grow into a city. This is the escalator theory of space development, and it has a powerful intuitive appeal. We see this pattern everywhere in human history. A trading post becomes a village becomes a town becomes a city. Surely the same organic growth can happen on the moon. But this argument ignores a critical reality. Apollo did not lead to a permanent presence. The program flew 6 successful landings between 1969 and 1972, and then it stopped. Not because the technology failed, not because astronauts refused to go, because the political will evaporated, because the economic case was never established, because sustaining a human presence on the moon requires ongoing investment at a scale that no democratic government has ever maintained for a program with no direct economic return to taxpayers. The Apollo hardware was so expensive to operate and so narrowly designed for short missions that it could not evolve into a sustained program without a complete redesign that Congress was unwilling to fund. The escalator stopped, the door closed, and it stayed closed for over 50 years. The escalator theory also assumes that each step naturally leads to the next, but in reality, each step requires its own independent justification. Landing astronauts justifies itself through national prestige and scientific discovery. Building a base justifies itself through technology development and geopolitical competition with China. But building a city requires an entirely different class of justification. It requires an economic reason for thousands of people to live permanently on the moon. It requires industries that generate revenue exceeding the astronomical cost of operating in a vacuum. It requires a quality of life that makes people choose to stay rather than return to Earth. It requires birth rates and education systems and healthcare infrastructure and cultural institutions. None of these follow automatically from building a base. Each one demands its own solution to problems that are entirely distinct from the problems of exploration. The trading post analogy fails for another reason. On Earth, trading posts grew into cities because the surrounding environment provided free resources: air to breathe, water to drink, soil to farm, timber to build, gravity that matched human biology, a magnetic field that blocked lethal radiation, an atmosphere that maintained livable pressure and temperature. Every city in human history grew from a seed planted in an environment that was already fundamentally habitable. The city did not have to create its own atmosphere. It did not have to generate its own magnetic field. It did not have to manufacture air or shield its residents from cosmic radiation. The environment provided all of this for free. The moon provides none of it. Every breath, every drop of water, every degree of warmth, every pascal of pressure, every barrier against radiation must be engineered, built, maintained, and powered by human systems. The environmental foundation that made every city on Earth possible simply does not exist on the moon, and replicating it artificially at city scale is a challenge of a fundamentally different order than anything in human experience. The geopolitical competition with China adds another layer of complexity to this conversation. The framing of the new space race has generated genuine urgency, and that urgency has accelerated timelines and loosened budgets in ways that benefit the Artemis program materially. But geopolitical competition is a double-edged justification. It motivates rapid action, but it also rewards symbolic achievements over sustainable development. The political incentive is to be first, not to be permanent. If the goal is to beat China to the South Pole, the optimal strategy is a series of crude landings that demonstrate capability and establish presence quickly. That strategy does not require a city. It requires flags, footprints, and functioning hardware on the surface. And once the symbolic victory is achieved, once the geopolitical point is made, the political urgency that funded the program may fade. Just as it did after Apollo 11, just as it did after the Space Shuttle program lost its post-Challenger momentum, just as it happens with every program whose primary justification is geopolitical rather than economic. This is not cynicism. This is the historical pattern, repeated with painful consistency across 6 decades of space exploration. The United States landed 12 astronauts on the moon between 1969 and 1972. Every one of them came home. No base was built. No permanent infrastructure was left behind. The flags are still there, bleached white by decades of unfiltered solar radiation. The descent stages of the lunar modules sit silently on the regolith, monuments to a program that ended not because it failed, but because its political justification expired. The political conditions that enabled Apollo were specific, temporary, and unrepeatable in their exact form. The political conditions enabling Artemis may prove equally transient, no matter how permanent the language in the authorization bills sounds today. None of this means the moon will remain untouched. The current momentum is real and likely to produce genuine results that will reshape humanity's relationship with its nearest celestial neighbor. Humans will walk on the lunar surface again within the next few years. Hardware will be placed on the South Pole that remains and functions for years between crew visits. Science will be conducted that reshapes our understanding of the moon's formation, its volatile resources, and its potential as a platform for deeper space exploration. International partnerships will deepen. Commercial capabilities will expand. The cost of reaching the lunar surface will decrease, as competition between SpaceX, Blue Origin, and future entrants drives innovation. The moon will become a more familiar destination, not a more distant one. But familiar and settled are not the same thing. A destination you visit repeatedly is still a destination. A workplace you staff on rotation is still a workplace. A laboratory you supply from Earth is still a laboratory. Calling these things a city does not make them one. And investing them with expectations of urban permanence does a disservice both to the programs that are working and to the honest assessment of what it would actually take to build something deserving of the name. The question this story asks is not whether NASA will succeed at its mission. NASA will almost certainly succeed at what it is actually trying to do. The real question is whether what NASA is trying to do bears any structural resemblance to building a city. And the answer, when examined honestly against the physical, institutional, and economic realities, is no. Not because NASA lacks ambition, not because the engineers lack talent, not because the politicians lack commitment, but because building a city on the moon requires solving problems that fall entirely outside the mandate, the capability, and the institutional design of any space agency that has ever existed. To understand why, we need to look at the moon itself, not as a destination, not as a symbol, not as a geopolitical prize, as a physical environment. Because the moon is not merely difficult to live on. The moon is actively hostile to the kind of permanent, large-scale human presence that the word city implies, and the nature of that hostility is not what most people imagine. The dangers of the lunar surface are well known in general terms. No air, no liquid water, extreme temperatures, low gravity. But what matters for our question is not whether these hazards exist. What matters is how they behave when you try to scale from a 4-person habitat to a community of thousands. Problems that are solvable at mission scale become overwhelming at city scale. Engineering solutions that work for a single module collapse when applied to a neighborhood. Redundancy that protects a crew of 4 cannot protect a population of 10,000. This compounding effect is the central argument of what comes next. It is the reason why the gap between a base and a city is not a gap of degree, but a gap of kind. And it is the reason why the most honest answer to the question in our title is not that it would be very hard, or that it will take a very long time, or that it probably will not happen soon. The most honest answer is that building a true city on the moon requires capabilities so far beyond current technology, current economics, and current institutional design that the project belongs to a different era of human civilization entirely. An era that may come, but an era that has not arrived. And the next part of this story will show you exactly why. The moon looks peaceful from Earth, a silver disk hanging in the night sky, seemingly gentle, seemingly still. Poets have written about its beauty for thousands of years. Astronauts who have seen it up close describe something very different. Buzz Aldrin called the lunar surface magnificent desolation. That word, desolation, carries more scientific weight than most people realize, because the moon is not just empty, it is aggressively, relentlessly, mechanistically hostile to human life in ways that go far beyond the absence of air. Every square meter of the lunar surface is a machine for killing human beings, operating continuously, silently, and without any prospect of stopping. And while that hostility can be managed for short visits by small crews in heavily engineered habitats, it becomes a fundamentally different problem when you try to scale human presence from a research station to a city. This part of the story is not about danger in the generic sense. Everyone knows the moon is dangerous. What matters for the question of whether a city can exist there is something more specific. It is the way individual hazards compound and interact when you multiply the number of people, the duration of their stay, and the physical footprint of their infrastructure. Each hazard on its own is solvable at mission scale. Together, at city scale, They form a wall that current engineering cannot climb. Start with radiation, not as a vague threat, but as a measured, quantified physical reality. The Moon has no global magnetic field. It has no atmosphere. On Earth, you are shielded from the worst of cosmic radiation by two overlapping barriers. The magnetosphere deflects charged particles from the Sun and from deep space, funneling them toward the poles where they produce auroras instead of casualties. The atmosphere absorbs what remains, reducing the radiation dose at sea level to approximately 2.4 millisieverts per year from natural sources. You live your entire life inside this invisible cocoon without ever thinking about it. The Moon has neither barrier. Every particle of galactic cosmic radiation that enters the inner solar system strikes the lunar surface at full energy. Every proton accelerated by a solar flare hits the regolith unimpeded. In 2019, China's Chang'e 4 lander carried a German-built dosimeter called the Lunar Lander Neutron and Dosimetry Instrument to the far side of the Moon. It recorded approximately 60 microsieverts per hour on the surface. That measurement, taken during a period of low solar activity when galactic cosmic ray flux is at its highest, translates to roughly 526 millisieverts per year of unshielded exposure. During solar maximum, when the Sun's magnetic field deflects more galactic cosmic rays, the dose drops to approximately 110 to 200 millisieverts per year. But solar maximum also brings solar particle events, sudden bursts of high-energy protons from solar flares and coronal mass ejections that can deliver acute doses exceeding 1 sievert in a matter of hours. The August 1972 solar particle event, which occurred between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, would have exposed unshielded astronauts on the lunar surface to more than 10 Gray to the skin and 2 Gray to the bone marrow. That dose would have caused severe skin blistering, ulceration, tissue necrosis, nausea, vomiting, and potentially fatal bone marrow damage. NASA's current career space permissible exposure limit is 600 millisieverts total accumulated dose for an astronaut's entire career. At the unshielded lunar surface dose rate during solar minimum, an astronaut would approach that career limit in roughly 14 months. During solar maximum, the chronic dose is lower, but a single large solar particle event could push an astronaut past their limit in hours. Now, for a mission, this is manageable. You limit surface time, you schedule extravehicular activities carefully, you build a habitat with enough shielding to reduce the chronic dose, you include a radiation storm shelter with additional mass to protect against solar particle events. For 4 people spending 6 months at a base, the engineering is difficult but achievable. NASA has studied regolith shielding extensively. Piling lunar soil over a habitat to a depth of approximately 10 grams per square centimeter reduces solar particle event doses below 30-day regulatory limits. Increasing the shielding to 180 grams per square centimeter, equivalent to roughly 1 meter of packed regolith, reduces galactic cosmic ray doses by about 25% compared to an unshielded environment. That is significant but not transformative. Galactic cosmic rays are so energetic that no practical amount of passive shielding eliminates them entirely. The particles simply have too much energy. They penetrate meters of material and produce secondary radiation, neutrons and gamma rays, that can actually increase the dose behind certain thicknesses of shielding. This phenomenon, called secondary particle production, means that adding more mass does not always help. There is an optimal shielding thickness beyond which returns diminish sharply. For a base, you accept this limitation. You shield the sleeping quarters and the storm shelter. You monitor crew dosimetry. You rotate personnel before they approach career limits. You accept a slightly elevated cancer risk as an occupational hazard, the same way commercial airline pilots accept higher cosmic ray exposure than the general population. But for a city, the calculus changes entirely. A city has children. A city has pregnant women. A city has elderly residents with accumulated lifetime exposure. A city has people who are not trained astronauts willing to accept elevated occupational risk. A city has schools and playgrounds and parks and transit corridors and industrial facilities and agricultural domes. Every single one of these spaces must be shielded to a standard that protects not the healthiest and most risk-tolerant adults on Earth, but the most vulnerable members of a diverse, permanent population. Shielding a single habitat module with a meter of regolith is an engineering project. Shielding an entire urban footprint with the same standard is a construction campaign requiring millions of tons of lunar soil to be excavated, transported, and placed with precision. And that shielding only reduces the galactic cosmic ray dose by roughly a quarter. To achieve Earth-level radiation protection on the lunar surface, you would need to build underground, burying habitable volume beneath meters of rock or retreating into lava tubes whose roofs provide natural shielding. Lunar lava tubes are real. Orbital observations suggest some are large enough to contain entire cities, but accessing them, reinforcing them, pressurizing them, and building livable infrastructure inside them are challenges of a scale that no engineering team has ever attempted. The estimated stable temperature inside a lava tube is approximately 17 degrees Celsius, which is favorable. But the structural integrity of a tube that has been undisturbed for billions of years and must now support pressurized habitation, utility systems, transportation infrastructure, and agricultural facilities has never been tested. Using a lava tube as a city site is an attractive concept on paper and an almost entirely uncharacterized engineering problem in practice. Radiation alone does not prevent a lunar city, but it constrains the design so severely that every other challenge becomes harder. Every habitable space must be buried or heavily shielded. Every surface activity must be time-limited and monitored. Every resident accumulates dose continuously, and no amount of administrative control can reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure to Earth normal levels using any shielding technology that currently exists. For a base, you work within these constraints. For a city, the constraints reshape the entire concept of urban life into something unrecognizable. Now, add lunar dust. Not as a nuisance, but as a systemic engineering antagonist. The moon's surface is covered in regolith, a layer of fragmented rock and soil created by billions of years of micrometeorite bombardment. Unlike terrestrial dust, which is rounded and smoothed by wind and water erosion, lunar dust particles are sharp, jagged, and angular. They have never been weathered. Under a microscope, they look like tiny shards of broken glass. The smallest particles measure less than 10 micrometers, fine enough to penetrate deep into human lung tissue if inhaled. But the mechanical properties are only the beginning. Lunar dust is electrostatically charged. The moon's surface is constantly bombarded by solar wind, a stream of charged particles from the sun that imparts electrostatic charge to regolith particles. This charge makes the dust cling to any surface it contacts with a tenacity that has no terrestrial equivalent. During the Apollo missions, astronauts discovered that lunar dust adhered to spacesuits so aggressively that brushing, vacuuming, and wiping could not fully remove it. The particles stuck to visors, gloves, life support connectors, and suit joints. Dust was tracked into the lunar module after every extravehicular activity, contaminating the cabin atmosphere. Every Apollo astronaut who walked on the moon reported respiratory symptoms after returning to the module. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, described it as lunar hay fever, with sneezing, watery eyes, and sore throat. These symptoms resolved after a few hours, but the exposures were extraordinarily brief, measured in hours rather than years. The chemical reactivity of lunar dust adds another dimension. Because there is no atmosphere and no moisture on the lunar surface, the freshly fractured mineral surfaces of regolith particles retain dangling chemical bonds that react aggressively with biological tissue. Studies using lunar dust simulants treated to mimic solar wind exposure have demonstrated that these particles cause cell death, DNA damage, and inflammatory responses in human lung epithelial cells. The particles also contain nanophase metallic iron, a product of space weathering that enhances their chemical reactivity. Peer-reviewed toxicology studies published in the journal NPJ Microgravity have concluded that while the full spectrum of health effects from chronic low-dose lunar dust exposure is not yet well understood, the mechanical irritancy and chemical reactivity of the particles pose serious potential risks, including pulmonary inflammation, fibrotic remodeling, and chronic respiratory disease. For a mission lasting days or weeks, dust management is a tractable problem. You design airlocks with dust mitigation features. You develop electrodynamic dust shields that use electric fields to repel charged particles from surfaces. You limit the number of airlock cycles. You use dedicated suits that remain outside the pressurized habitat. You accept that some contamination will occur and manage it with air filtration. NASA has been actively developing these technologies, testing electrodynamic dust shields on the International Space Station and on commercial lunar landers. But for a city, the problem scales exponentially. A city of thousands would require hundreds or thousands of airlock cycles per day as workers, maintenance crews, rover operators, and surface construction teams move between pressurized and unpressurized environments. Every cycle introduces dust. Dust accumulates on mechanical seals, degrading their integrity over time. It coats optical surfaces, reducing the efficiency of solar panels and sensors. It infiltrates electrical connectors, creating short circuits. It abrades moving parts in mechanisms, reducing their operational lifespan. On Apollo missions, regolith ate through spacesuit boots and degraded the vacuum seals of sample containers within hours of exposure. For a base with a small crew conducting limited surface operations, the maintenance burden is manageable. For a city with continuous industrial and residential activity on the surface, dust becomes a systemic threat to infrastructure reliability. Every seal, every joint, every moving part, every optical surface, every electrical connection in the entire urban footprint is under constant assault from a substance that cannot be fully excluded and cannot be easily removed. And then consider the dust inside. In a pressurized city environment, any dust that enters the atmosphere becomes a respiratory hazard for every resident. Children, whose lungs are still developing, would be particularly vulnerable. Elderly residents with reduced pulmonary function would face elevated risk. Air filtration can remove particles from the atmosphere, but the ultrafine fraction, particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers, is the most biologically dangerous and the most difficult to capture. Long-term exposure to respirable mineral dust on Earth causes silicosis, a progressive and irreversible fibrotic lung disease. Lunar dust shares many of the characteristics that make terrestrial silica dangerous: fine particle size, crystalline structure, chemical reactivity, and adds unique hazards including electrostatic adhesion and nanophase ion content. No one has studied the effects of chronic, multi-year, low-level lunar dust inhalation on human health because no one has ever been exposed for that long. The longest lunar surface stay in history was Apollo 17, at approximately 75 hours total, with roughly 22 hours spent outside on extravehicular activities. Extrapolating from 75 hours to a lifetime is not science, it is speculation, and building a city on the foundation of that speculation is not engineering, it is hope. Now layer in the thermal environment. The Moon's rotation period is approximately 29.5 Earth days, which means any given point on the equatorial surface experiences roughly 14 days of continuous sunlight, followed by 14 days of continuous darkness. During the day, surface temperatures reach approximately 127 degrees Celsius. During the night, they plunge to approximately negative 173 degrees Celsius. That is a swing of 300 degrees Celsius every lunar day-night cycle. No common structural material on Earth is designed to endure thermal cycling of this magnitude indefinitely. Metals expand and contract. Seals degrade, joints fatigue, connections loosen. Over years and decades, the thermal environment slowly destroys any infrastructure exposed to it, unless that infrastructure is specifically designed to accommodate extreme thermal stress. The south polar locations being targeted for Artemis offer a partial advantage. Elevated crater rims near the poles receive near constant sunlight, which moderates temperature extremes and provides consistent solar power. But the permanently shadowed regions where water ice is expected to exist are among the coldest environments in the solar system, with temperatures dropping below -230 degrees Celsius. Any infrastructure that connects sunlit areas to permanently shadowed regions must bridge an extraordinary thermal gradient. Pipelines, cables, transport routes, and structural supports crossing this gradient face engineering challenges that have no precedent in terrestrial construction. For a base, you choose your location carefully. You build on a sunlit ridge. You keep your habitat in a thermally favorable zone. You send robotic missions into the permanently shadowed regions to extract water ice and return it to the base. The thermal challenge is localized and managed through site selection and operational discipline. For a city, the thermal environment constrains everything. An urban footprint extending across multiple kilometers would inevitably span regions with different thermal profiles. Transit infrastructure connecting different parts of the city would need to function across thermal gradients. Industrial facilities processing regolith or extracting volatiles would generate their own thermal loads that must be managed in a vacuum where convective cooling does not exist. Heat rejection in a vacuum is accomplished only through radiation, which is far less efficient than convective or conductive cooling in an atmosphere. Every watt of waste heat produced by city infrastructure must be radiated into space through large surface areas. At city scale, thermal management becomes one of the dominant engineering challenges, consuming energy, adding mass, and constraining the physical layout of every structure. Now consider vacuum. The Moon has no atmosphere. The surface pressure is approximately 3 × 10 to the -15 atmospheres, effectively a perfect vacuum by any engineering standard. On Earth, buildings are passive structures. They stand because gravity holds them down, and the atmosphere exerts equal pressure on all surfaces. They require no active systems to maintain a breathable interior environment. Walls keep out weather but do not hold in air. Doors can be left open. Windows can be broken without catastrophic consequences. On the Moon, every habitable space is a pressure vessel. The internal atmosphere must be maintained at a pressure of roughly 1 atmosphere, or some reduced pressure oxygen-enriched mixture, against a perfect vacuum outside. This pressure differential exerts enormous force on the walls, seals, windows, hatches, and penetrations of every structure. A single square meter of wall at 1 atmosphere of differential pressure bears a load of approximately 10,300 kilograms. Every penetration, every window, every door, every utility connection, every airlock is a potential point of catastrophic failure. A breach in a pressurized habitat on the Moon does not result in a drafty room. It results in explosive decompression that can kill everyone inside within minutes. For a base housing 4 people in a single module, pressure integrity is managed through rigorous quality control, redundant seals, constant monitoring, and emergency protocols. The module is a spacecraft. It is built to spacecraft standards. It is tested and certified like a spacecraft. The crew is trained to respond to pressure emergencies like spacecraft crew. For a city, pressurized volume must be scaled from tens of cubic meters to potentially millions of cubic meters. The number of seals, penetrations, connections, hatches, windows, and structural joints increases by orders of magnitude. Each one is a potential failure point. Each one must maintain integrity for decades, not months. The probability of a pressure breach somewhere in the system over a period of years approaches certainty. This means city-scale pressurized infrastructure must be designed, with compartmentalization so thorough that any breach is contained before it kills more than a small number of people. It must include rapid response pressure doors that seal automatically. It must provide emergency breathing equipment accessible within seconds from any point in the city. It must assume that breaches will happen regularly and design for survival rather than prevention alone. This is not how cities work on Earth. On Earth, structural failure in one building does not threaten the survival of the entire neighborhood. On the Moon, A structural failure in one pressurized section can propagate through connected volumes if compartmentalization fails. The interconnected nature of urban infrastructure, transit corridors, utility conduits, pedestrian passages, creates pathways for pressure loss to spread. Designing against this risk at city scale requires an architectural philosophy that has more in common with submarine design than with urban planning. Every room is a potential independent survival zone. Every corridor is a potential pressure boundary. Every door is a potential blast door. This is not a city in any sense that humans have ever built or inhabited. It is a survival machine shaped like a city. But the pressure constraint is not just an engineering problem. It is a quality of life problem that reshapes the entire human experience of living. Consider what daily existence inside a permanently sealed pressure vessel actually means. On Earth, you open a window when a room feels stuffy. On the Moon, opening a window kills everyone in the room. On Earth, you walk outside to clear your head. On the Moon, walking outside requires a pressure suit, an airlock cycle, a dust mitigation protocol, a radiation exposure budget check, and a return deadline. On Earth, a delivery arrives at your door. On the Moon, every object entering the habitat must pass through an airlock, be inspected for dust contamination, and be cleared before it enters the pressurized environment. On Earth, smoke from a kitchen triggers a fire alarm and you open a door. On the Moon, smoke in a sealed environment is a life-threatening contamination event requiring immediate atmospheric scrubbing and potential compartment isolation. On Earth, waste is collected and removed to a facility somewhere else. On the Moon, waste must be processed entirely within the pressurized volume or expelled through engineered systems that maintain pressure integrity during every cycle. Every trivial act of daily life that an Earth resident performs without thinking becomes a procedure on the Moon. Over days or weeks, this is tolerable. Astronauts are trained to operate within procedural frameworks. Over years and decades, for a permanent population that includes people who are not astronauts, the psychological and practical burden of living inside a machine becomes a defining feature of existence. A city is not just a collection of buildings. It is a lived environment that shapes the experience of its residents. A city where you cannot open a window, cannot step outside without a suit, cannot receive a package without a decontamination protocol, and cannot dispose of waste without an engineering procedure, is a city in name only. It is confinement with better architecture. And beneath all of these challenges lies the most uncertain variable of all: gravity. Or rather, the lack of it. The Moon's gravitational acceleration is approximately 1.62 meters per second squared, roughly 1/6 of Earth's 9.81 meters per second squared. For short missions, reduced gravity is manageable and even enjoyable. Apollo astronauts adapted quickly and performed their tasks effectively despite the unfamiliar environment. The iconic footage of astronauts bouncing across the lunar surface suggests that low gravity is benign, even fun. But we have no long-term data on the health effects of 1/6 gravity. None. What we have is extensive data on microgravity from decades of research aboard the International Space Station, and that data is alarming. Astronauts in microgravity lose approximately 1 to 2% of bone mineral density per month in load-bearing bones. They experience significant muscle atrophy, particularly in the legs and lower back. Cardiovascular deconditioning occurs as the heart adapts to pumping blood without fighting full gravity. Intracranial pressure increases because fluid is no longer pulled downward by gravity, leading to a condition called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome that causes measurable changes in eye structure and vision impairment. Immune function is altered, wound healing is impaired. The vestibular system, which provides balance and spatial orientation, becomes confused. 1/6 gravity is not microgravity. It is reasonable to expect that some of these effects would be reduced in a partial gravity environment. But by how much? Nobody knows. There has never been a long-duration study of human health at 1/6 gravity, because no facility for conducting such a study exists. The International Space Station cannot simulate partial gravity. A rotating spacecraft could theoretically generate artificial gravity, but no such spacecraft has ever been built for human habitation. We are entirely in the dark about whether 1/6 gravity is sufficient to prevent bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, vision impairment, and immune dysfunction over periods of years and decades. For a base, this uncertainty is manageable. You rotate crews every 6 months. You prescribe rigorous exercise regimens. You monitor bone density and cardiovascular health. You return astronauts to Earth before any damage becomes irreversible. The health effects of 6 months at 1/6 gravity are unknown but probably recoverable. For a city, the uncertainty is existential. A city requires generational permanence. People must live there for entire lifetimes. Children must be born there and grow to adulthood. The developmental effects of 1/6 gravity on a growing human skeleton, a developing cardiovascular system, a forming brain, are completely unknown. Can a human fetus develop normally at 1/6 gravity? Can an infant's bones ossify properly under 1/6 of the gravitational stimulus that shaped every human skeleton in evolutionary history? Can a child's inner ear develop normal vestibular function? Can a teenager's heart grow strong enough to function if they ever visit Earth? These are not rhetorical questions. They are unanswered empirical questions with no data. And building a permanent city that depends on generational reproduction without answering them first is not bold, it is reckless. Some researchers have proposed that centrifugal systems could supplement lunar gravity. A large rotating structure within the city could provide Earth-normal gravity for sleeping quarters, exercise facilities, or medical treatment. This is theoretically possible but adds enormous engineering complexity. A centrifuge large enough to avoid severe Coriolis effects at its rotation rate would need to be tens of meters in radius, consuming significant pressurized volume and structural mass. Incorporating such systems into a city design transforms the architecture into something even more complex and fragile than it already is. Every one of the physical barriers described in this part follows the same pattern. At mission scale, the problem is solvable. At base scale, the problem is manageable. At city scale, the problem becomes either unsolved or so expensive to solve that it transforms the entire concept of what a city is. Radiation shielding for 4 people is an engineering project. Radiation shielding for 10,000 people is a mining and construction operation on a scale never attempted off Earth. Dust management for a dozen airlock cycles per week is a maintenance task. Dust management for thousands of daily cycles is a public health infrastructure challenge. Thermal control for a single habitat is a system design problem. Thermal control for an urban footprint is a thermodynamic engineering campaign. Pressure containment for one module is a spacecraft certification process. Pressure containment for millions of cubic meters of interconnected habitable volume is an architectural revolution. Gravity mitigation for a rotating crew is a medical protocol. Gravity mitigation for a permanent population, including children, is an unsolved biological question. This is the physical wall, not any single hazard. The compounding interaction of every hazard at a scale that no human institution has ever attempted to address simultaneously, in an environment that provides none of the free resources: atmosphere, magnetic shielding, thermal regulation, pressure, that make cities possible on Earth. And here is what makes the wall even higher. Every one of these physical challenges must be solved before you even begin to address the institutional, economic, and organizational challenges of building a city. You cannot govern a community that cannot breathe. You cannot establish an economy and a settlement that cannot survive a pressure breach. You cannot raise children in an environment whose biological effects on development are completely unknown. The physical barriers come first. They are the prerequisite, and they are not close to being met at city scale. But even if every physical barrier described here were somehow solved tomorrow, the Moon City would still face a wall equally formidable, because surviving on the Moon is a physics problem. But building a city there is an institutional problem, a political problem, an economic problem. And the institutions, politics, and economics of lunar development are even less prepared for city-scale ambition than the engineering is. That is what comes next. Assume for a moment that every physical problem described in the previous section has been solved. Imagine that some future generation of engineers has cracked the radiation shielding problem at urban scale. Imagine that lunar dust management has been reduced to routine maintenance. Imagine that thermal regulation, pressure containment, and partial gravity health effects have all been addressed through technologies that do not yet exist, but someday might. Even in this generous hypothetical, a city on the moon still does not get built, because the barriers that remain are not barriers of physics. They are barriers of money, of politics, of organizational structure, and of economic logic. And these barriers are in many ways harder to overcome than the physical ones. You can engineer around a radiation flux. You cannot engineer around a congressional appropriations cycle. Start with the most fundamental constraint: money. NASA does not have a budget for building a city. NASA does not have a budget for building a base. NASA has a budget for building a series of missions that, if everything goes according to plan, will incrementally establish the infrastructure for intermittent crewed surface operations at one location on the moon over the course of roughly a decade. That budget is under constant political pressure, subject to annual appropriations, vulnerable to presidential transitions, and historically inadequate for the programs it is supposed to fund. In fiscal year 2026, Congress provided approximately $7.8 billion for Artemis systems through its regular appropriations process. An additional $6.7 billion was allocated for Orion, Gateway, and the Space Launch System through a Reconciliation Act, with funds available through fiscal year 2032. These are significant sums. They represent a genuine national commitment to returning humans to the moon. They are also nowhere near sufficient for anything beyond the existing mission architecture. Consider the cost structure. A single launch of the Space Launch System costs approximately $4 billion. That figure includes not just propellant and launch operations, but the amortized cost of maintaining the workforce, facilities, and supply chain required to build and operate the most powerful rocket in the world. The Trump administration's proposed fiscal year 2026 budget initially sought to cut NASA's total budget by 24%, from $24.8 billion to approximately $18.8 billion, and to cancel the Space Launch System and Orion after Artemis 3. Congress ultimately preserved funding, but the proposal reveals the political fragility of even the existing program. A single budget cycle with different political priorities could gut Artemis entirely. The Government Accountability Office has estimated that cost overruns on 3 major Artemis projects total $6.8 billion. NASA has not established an official cost estimate for the Artemis 3 mission, let alone for subsequent missions. The GAO has noted that NASA does not plan to measure the production costs for SLS rockets that constitute a significant proportion of future Artemis-related costs. In other words, the agency building the moon program does not fully know what its own moon program costs. This is not unusual for large government programs. It is, however, a revealing indicator of the institutional relationship between NASA and the kind of cost discipline that a city-scale project would demand. Now consider what a lunar city would actually cost. No rigorous estimate exists because no institution has seriously attempted to plan one. But we can construct rough boundaries using what we know about space logistics and terrestrial construction. The International Space Station, which houses 6 to 7 crew members in low Earth orbit, has cost over $150 billion across its lifetime, including development, assembly, operations, and resupply. It occupies approximately 1,000 cubic meters of pressurized volume. It is located approximately 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, reachable in 6 hours by spacecraft. It has been under continuous construction, maintenance, and resupply for over 25 years, and it supports fewer people than a single apartment building. The Moon is approximately 1,000 times farther away than the International Space Station. Reaching it requires substantially more energy, more fuel, and more complex mission architectures. Every kilogram delivered to the lunar surface costs vastly more than a kilogram delivered to low Earth orbit. Estimates vary depending on the launch vehicle and mission profile, but figures of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per kilogram to the lunar surface are widely cited in the literature. At the lower end of that range, delivering the mass equivalent of a single international space station to the lunar surface would cost on the order of several $100 billion in launch costs alone before a single wall is assembled or a single system is activated. A city for even 1,000 people, a tiny city by terrestrial standards, would require orders of magnitude more pressurized volume than the International Space Station. It would need agricultural facilities, manufacturing infrastructure, power systems, waste processing, water recycling, medical facilities, educational spaces, recreation areas, maintenance shops, storage depots, transportation corridors, and emergency shelters. Conservative estimates suggest that a permanent settlement for 1,000 people would require delivering millions of kilograms of material to the lunar surface before in situ manufacturing could begin, offsetting Earth imports. At current launch costs, this represents a price tag measured in trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions. No nation on Earth has ever committed trillions of dollars to a single infrastructure project. The entire United States interstate highway system, the most ambitious public works project in American history, cost approximately $530 billion in inflation-adjusted terms and took over 35 years to build. It serves 330 million people across a continent with breathable air, drinkable water, natural gravity, and an existing industrial base. A lunar city serving 1,000 people in a vacuum would likely cost several times as much while serving a fraction of a percent of the population served by the highway system. The political case for such an expenditure does not currently exist. It is not clear what political conditions could make it exist within any foreseeable time frame. This brings us to the second institutional barrier. The way NASA is structured and the way its goals are defined are fundamentally misaligned with settlement. NASA is an exploration agency. Its mandate, established by the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 and refined through subsequent legislation, centers on the expansion of human knowledge of the Earth and of phenomena in the atmosphere and space. The agency's culture, workforce, procurement systems, and institutional incentives are all organized around the design and execution of missions. Missions have defined objectives, timelines, success criteria, and end dates. They launch. They operate. They conclude. Data is collected. Reports are written. The next mission begins. A city has no end date. A city does not have a mission success criteria document. A city does not launch, operate, and conclude. A city grows, adapts, evolves, and persists. It generates its own objectives. It defines its own success. It does not report to a program office in Houston. It governs itself. The institutional architecture required to plan, build, and sustain a city is fundamentally different from the institutional architecture required to plan, execute, and evaluate a mission. This is not a criticism of NASA. It is a description of what NASA was designed to do and what it was not designed to do. An agency organized around missions cannot smoothly transform into an agency organized around settlement, any more than a hospital can smoothly transform into a hotel. Both involve buildings with beds and staff who care for occupants, but the institutional logic is entirely different. The goals are different. The metrics are different. The organizational structure is different. Asking NASA to build a city is like asking a research university to build and operate a shopping mall. The university has engineers, architects, budget managers, and project planners. It has many of the individual capabilities required, but its institutional purpose, its culture, its incentive structure, and its accountability systems are not aligned with retail commerce. It would build a very academic shopping mall that no one would want to shop in. NASA's Artemis program explicitly describes its lunar objectives in terms of exploration and technology development. The stated purpose is to explore more of the lunar surface than ever before, to collaborate with commercial and international partners, to establish the first long-term presence on the Moon, and to lay the foundation for eventually sending humans to Mars. Every one of these objectives is an exploration objective. None is a settlement objective. The Moon, in NASA's architecture, is not a destination in itself. It is a proving ground, a stepping stone, a testbed for Mars. The agency's own framing treats the Moon as a waypoint, not a home. This means that every design decision in the Artemis architecture reflects exploration priorities rather than settlement priorities. The foundational surface habitat assumes a crew of 4, serviced by resupply missions from Earth on a regular cadence. It is not designed to be expanded by its occupants using local resources. It is not designed to support families. It is not designed to grow food at scale. It is not designed to manufacture replacement components from lunar materials. It is a research station, an exceptionally capable research station that will enable groundbreaking science, but a research station nonetheless. The third institutional barrier is resupply dependence. Every crewed facility in space that has ever existed has been entirely dependent on Earth for survival. The International Space Station receives regular resupply missions carrying food, water, spare parts, experiments, clothing, and crew. If those missions stopped, the station would become uninhabitable within months. The crew would need to evacuate, the systems would degrade, the station would die. The Artemis base camp will face the same dependence, multiplied by the difficulty of reaching the lunar surface. The International Space Station orbits 400 kilometers above Earth. A Falcon 9 rocket can deliver cargo there for approximately $2,700 per kilogram. The Moon is 384,000 kilometers away. Delivering cargo to the lunar surface requires a vastly more complex and expensive logistics chain. Every calorie consumed by an astronaut at the South Pole was grown on Earth, processed on Earth, packaged on Earth, loaded onto a rocket on Earth, launched to orbit, transferred to a lunar transit vehicle, flown to lunar orbit, transferred to a lander, and descended to the surface. The total energy and cost embedded in a single meal delivered to the lunar surface is staggering. For a base supporting 4 people on 6-month rotations, the resupply requirement is large but finite. Estimates based on International Space Station experience suggest approximately 6,000 kilograms of consumables per crew member per year, though lunar missions might reduce this through partial recycling of water and air. For 4 crew members, that represents roughly 24,000 kilograms per year of consumables alone, not including spare parts, scientific equipment, rover propellant, or habitat maintenance supplies. Now scale to a city. 1,000 permanent residents consuming 6,000 kilograms of supplies per person per year require 6 million kilograms of annual resupply. At even the most optimistic projected launch costs of $5,000 per kilogram to the lunar surface, that is $30 billion per year in logistics costs alone. Every year. Indefinitely. This figure does not include the cost of building or maintaining the city itself. It does not include crew transport. It does not include emergency evacuation capability. It is simply the cost of feeding and supplying the population. And the logistics problem has a dark corollary that is almost never discussed. Emergency evacuation. A base housing 4 people can be evacuated using a single lander. If a catastrophic failure occurs, the crew boards their ascent vehicle and returns to lunar orbit, where Orion or Gateway provides a path home. The entire Artemis architecture is built around this assumption. There is always a way out, a way home, a vehicle waiting. But a city of 1,000 people cannot be evacuated. No vehicle that exists or is planned could remove a large population from the lunar surface in an emergency. This means that a city must be designed to survive every conceivable catastrophe without evacuation. Every pressure breach, every power failure, Every life support malfunction, every radiation storm, every structural collapse must be survivable internally, using only the resources and systems available within the city itself. This requirement does not merely add complexity, it fundamentally transforms the design philosophy of every system in the settlement, compounding every engineering challenge described earlier by removing the option of retreat. A base can fail and be abandoned. A city must endure, or its residents die. That difference alone separates exploration architecture from settlement architecture more starkly than any other single factor. In situ resource utilization is the technology that is supposed to break this dependence. ISRU encompasses a range of processes for extracting useful materials from the lunar environment. The highest priority target is water ice in permanently shadowed craters at the South Pole. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, providing breathable air and rocket propellant. Regolith can theoretically be processed into construction materials, metals and glass. Lunar soil contains oxygen bound in mineral oxides that can be extracted through various chemical processes. The promise of ISRU is real. The technology has been demonstrated at laboratory scale on Earth. NASA has funded multiple ISRU research programs and plans to test extraction technologies on the lunar surface during Artemis missions. But the gap between laboratory demonstration and industrial production is enormous. Extracting water ice from permanently shadowed craters requires operating mining equipment in complete darkness at temperatures below -230 degrees Celsius. The ice is not sitting in convenient deposits. It is mixed with regolith at concentrations that may be as low as a few percent by weight. Extracting useful quantities requires processing vast amounts of material. The energy requirements are substantial. The equipment must function autonomously in one of the most extreme environments in the solar system. No ISRU system has ever produced usable quantities of any resource on the lunar surface. The technology readiness level for lunar ISRU at industrial scale remains low. Even optimistic projections place meaningful production capabilities years or decades in the future. And meaningful in this context means enough to supplement base operations, not enough to sustain a city. The gap between producing a few litres of water from regolith as a technology demonstration and producing millions of litres per year as a municipal water supply is not a gap of incremental improvement. It is a gap of industrial revolution. The fourth barrier is the absence of manufacturing self-sufficiency. A city does not just consume resources, it produces them. It manufactures the tools, components, and systems it needs to sustain itself. It processes raw materials into finished goods. It repairs what breaks. It replaces what wears out. It builds new structures as the population grows. On Earth, this manufacturing capability exists within a global industrial ecosystem of extraordinary complexity. A single smartphone contains materials sourced from dozens of countries, processed in specialized facilities, assembled using tools that are themselves products of other specialized facilities. The supply chain that produces modern goods is a web of interdependencies spanning the entire planet. A lunar city cut off from this web would need to replicate enough of it to survive. Not all of it. A lunar city does not need to manufacture smartphones. But it does need to manufacture pressure seals, air filtration components, water recycling membranes, electrical connectors, structural fasteners, thermal insulation, radiation shielding elements, medical devices, agricultural equipment, power system components, and thousands of other items that wear out, break down, or need replacement over the lifetime of a permanent settlement. If any critical component cannot be manufactured locally and cannot be delivered from Earth in time, the city fails. No technology roadmap from any space agency addresses manufacturing self-sufficiency on the Moon. Three-dimensional printing using lunar regolith has been proposed for producing structural elements. Sintering, the process of heating powdered material until it fuses, has been demonstrated with regolith simulants in laboratory conditions. But producing a structural brick from sintered regolith is a very long way from producing a functioning pressure seal, a biocompatible medical implant, or a high-efficiency solar cell. The diversity of materials and processes required for even a minimal manufacturing base is staggering. Metals must be extracted from ores and refined. Polymers must be synthesized from precursor chemicals. Semiconductors must be fabricated in clean room conditions. Glass must be produced with controlled optical properties. Each of these processes requires specialized equipment, energy, expertise, and quality control. Building this capability on the moon from scratch is not a project. It is a civilization-building exercise. The fifth barrier is governance. Cities have governments. They have laws, courts, police, tax systems, property registries, building codes, public health regulations, environmental standards, educational mandates, labor protections, and dispute resolution mechanisms. These institutions are not luxuries. They are the invisible infrastructure that makes collective human life possible. Without governance, a city is not a city. It is a camp where the strongest prevail and the weakest suffer. Nothing in the current legal or institutional framework for lunar operations addresses governance at settlement scale. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the foundational document of international space law, prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies. No nation can claim sovereignty over any part of the moon. This prohibition was designed to prevent a colonial land grab, and it has been largely effective. But it also means that no legal framework exists for establishing property rights on the lunar surface. Without property rights, you cannot have a real estate market. Without a real estate market, you cannot have private investment in permanent structures. Without private investment, you cannot have an economy. Without an economy, you cannot have a city. The Artemis Accords, signed by over 40 nations as of 2026, attempt to create a framework for peaceful cooperation and resource utilization on the moon. They establish principles of transparency, interoperability, and the extraction of space resources in accordance with the Outer Space Treaty. But the Accords are not a legal code. They do not establish a court system. They do not create a tax authority. They do not define who has jurisdiction when a dispute arises between residents of a lunar settlement operated by a multinational consortium. They are a set of principles, useful and important, but entirely insufficient as the legal foundation for a functioning urban community. The governance gap is not merely a legal technicality. It reflects a deeper truth about the relationship between institutions and settlement. Every successful city in human history has existed within a governance framework that preceded it. The framework may have been monarchical, democratic, colonial, or corporate, but it existed. People did not build cities and then invent governance afterward. They built cities because governance frameworks created the conditions of stability, predictability, and rule of law that made collective investment rational. On the moon, no such framework exists. And creating one requires international agreement of a kind that has proven extraordinarily difficult to achieve on issues far less complex than the governance of an extraterrestrial city. The sixth barrier is the one that underlies all the others. Economic purpose. Every city on Earth exists because it generates economic value. Cities are not charity projects, they are not monuments, they are not experiments. They are concentrations of human activity that produce more wealth than they consume. People move to cities because cities offer economic opportunities. Businesses locate in cities because cities offer markets, labor pools, infrastructure, and proximity to other businesses. The economic logic of urbanization is the gravitational force that pulls cities into existence and sustains them across centuries. The moon has no economic logic for urbanization. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Multiple potential lunar industries have been proposed. Lunar mining for rare earth elements or helium-3, lunar tourism for wealthy visitors, lunar manufacturing taking advantage of vacuum conditions and low gravity for specialized production, scientific research generating knowledge and prestige. Each of these proposals has been studied. None has produced a viable business case at the scale needed to support permanent urban infrastructure. Helium-3, an isotope rare on Earth but potentially abundant in lunar regolith, has been proposed as fuel for future fusion reactors, but commercial fusion power does not exist. No fusion reactor has achieved sustained net energy production. Building a lunar mining industry to supply fuel for a power technology that does not work yet is not a business plan. It is a speculation stacked on top of another speculation. Lunar tourism has a theoretical market. Several companies have sold reservations for suborbital flights, and a few private citizens have paid tens of millions of dollars for orbital trips. But tourism to the lunar surface requires a level of infrastructure, safety, and comfort that does not exist and would cost billions to create. The number of people able and willing to pay the price would be tiny. Tourism might generate revenue for a lunar base. It cannot sustain a city. Lunar mining for terrestrial markets faces a fundamental economic problem. The cost of extracting material on the moon and returning it to Earth is so high that only extraordinarily valuable materials could justify the logistics. No known lunar resource meets this threshold at current or projected costs. Water ice has value as propellant and life support consumable for lunar operations, but its economic value exists only within the context of a lunar program that is itself funded by government budgets. It does not generate independent economic returns. Without economic self-justification, a lunar city remains permanently dependent on subsidies from Earth. It exists only as long as taxpayers on another world are willing to fund it. This is not a city. This is a government program with residential quarters. The moment political priorities shift, the funding vanishes, and the city must be evacuated. This is precisely what happened to every ambitious government-funded settlement program in history that lacked local economic viability. Soviet closed cities, colonial outposts, resource extraction camps, they thrived while subsidized and collapsed when the subsidies ended. This is the institutional wall, a budget structure that cannot support city-scale expenditure, a mission-oriented agency that is not designed for settlement, a resupply dependence that no existing technology can break at the required scale, a manufacturing capability that does not exist even in concept, a governance vacuum that no international body is prepared to fill, and an economic logic that provides no self-sustaining reason for a city to exist. NASA is not failing at building a moon city. NASA was never asked to build one, never funded to build one, never designed to build one. The agency is doing exactly what it was created to do: exploring, discovering, developing technology, pushing the boundary of what humans can achieve in space, and it is doing this work with extraordinary competence under extraordinary constraints. The mismatch is not between NASA and the moon. It is between NASA and the expectations that have been projected onto its mission by a public that hears permanent base and imagines a permanent city. Those expectations are not NASA's fault. They are not even unreasonable given the language that politicians and media use to describe the program, but they are wrong. And the distance between what is expected and what is possible is not a gap that more money or more time will close. It is a categorical difference between two fundamentally different kinds of human enterprise. Exploration requires courage, engineering, and political will. Settlement requires all of those, plus economic self-sufficiency, industrial capacity, legal infrastructure, social institutions, and generational commitment on a scale that no human project has ever achieved off the surface of Earth. The moon will be explored. It is being explored right now, but the step from exploration to settlement is not a step on the same staircase. It is a leap to an entirely different building, and that building has not been constructed yet. What remains is the honest question. If not a city, then what? What will the moon actually become? What role will it play in human civilization? And is there a path, however long and uncertain, from where we are to where the dream imagines we could be? That is where this story ends. Not with a door closing, but with a clear view of what lies on the other side. So where does this leave us? Not in despair, not in cynicism, not in the comfortable position of declaring the moon pointless or the dream dead. the dream is not dead. The physics is real, the institutional constraints are real, and the economic gap is real. But reality is not the enemy of ambition. Reality is the material from which actual achievement is built. And the actual achievements that the moon will produce over the coming decades are worth understanding clearly, without the distortion of expectations borrowed from science fiction and inflated by political rhetoric. Let me describe, as honestly as possible, what the moon will actually become over the next 20 to 30 years if current programs proceed roughly as planned. Artemis 2 will fly astronauts around the moon and return them to Earth, demonstrating the Orion spacecraft's life support, navigation, and re-entry capabilities on a crewed deep space mission for the first time since 1972. This mission is not symbolic. It is a critical engineering shakedown that tests every system that future landing missions will depend on. If it succeeds, it unlocks the door to everything that follows. If it reveals problems, those problems get solved before lives are risked on the surface. Artemis 3 and subsequent missions will progressively test rendezvous, docking, and eventually crewed landing operations. When the first Artemis astronauts step onto the lunar surface, likely during the Artemis 4 mission in 2028 if timelines hold, they will arrive at the South Pole with capabilities that dwarf anything Apollo achieved. They will land using commercial vehicles developed by SpaceX or Blue Origin, vehicles designed for reuse and capable of delivering far more payload than the Apollo lunar module ever carried. They will wear next-generation spacesuits built by Axiom Space that allow greater mobility and longer surface operations. They will carry instruments designed to characterize the local environment, test resource extraction technologies, and conduct science that has been waiting half a century for human hands to perform. After the initial landings, the pace of development is intended to accelerate. NASA plans approximately annual missions to the South Pole through the late 2020s and into the early 2030s. Each mission will deliver additional infrastructure. The Lunar Gateway, an orbital station in a near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon, will serve as a staging point, communications relay, and temporary crew habitat. Surface elements will accumulate. An unpressurized rover for local traversals, a pressurized rover for multi-week excursions across the lunar terrain. Power systems, initially solar, potentially nuclear by the end of the decade. Scientific instruments, communications infrastructure, storage depots for supplies and equipment. The foundational surface habitat, planned for delivery around the Artemis 8 timeframe in the early 2030s, will mark a genuine inflection point. For the first time, astronauts will have a dedicated surface shelter capable of supporting extended stays independent of the lander. The habitat will provide life support, thermal control, radiation shielding, waste management, and workspace for a crew of 4. It will be the moon's first building, not a tent, not a spacecraft parked on the surface. A building designed to remain, designed to be revisited, designed to accumulate capability over successive missions. By the mid-2030s, if the program survives political transitions and budget pressures, the Artemis base camp could resemble a functional research station, a habitat, 2 rovers, power generation, communications, scientific laboratories, storage, landing and launch pads, a small but real human footprint on the lunar surface, occupied intermittently by rotating crews performing increasingly sophisticated scientific and engineering work. Some of that work will focus on in-situ resource utilization, experiments designed to determine whether water ice can be extracted from permanently shadowed craters in useful quantities, tests of regolith processing for construction materials, demonstrations of oxygen extraction from mineral oxides. These experiments will not produce industrial quantities of anything. They will produce data. And that data will determine whether the next phase of lunar development is feasible. This is what NASA will build. Not a city. Not a settlement. A research station in one of the most extreme environments human beings have ever worked in. And it will be extraordinary. But it is essential to understand what this research station actually represents in the broader taxonomy of human presence, because the language used to describe it will inevitably overshoot the reality, and calibrating expectations now is the only way to protect the program from the backlash of disappointment later. What the Artemis base camp represents is an outpost, a crude, intermittently occupied, Earth-dependent outpost on the surface of another world. It will be comparable in function, though not in environment, to the most isolated research stations on Earth, and the most instructive comparison is Antarctica. The Antarctic Treaty System, established in 1959, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve and bans military activity, mineral mining, and territorial sovereignty claims on the continent. Under this framework, dozens of nations operate research stations across Antarctica. Some have been continuously occupied for over 60 years. McMurdo Station, the largest Antarctic facility, supports over 1,000 personnel during the austral summer and approximately 250 through the winter. It has a harbour, airstrips, dormitories, laboratories, a power plant, a water treatment facility, a fire station, and a chapel. Palmer Station, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, and scores of smaller outposts dot the continent, housing researchers from around the world who study climate, geology, biology, astronomy, and atmospheric science. Antarctica has been continuously occupied by humans for more than a century if you count early expedition huts, and permanently staffed for over 60 years under the treaty system. It has received billions of dollars in cumulative investment from the world's wealthiest nations. It has a functioning logistics chain, established governance structures, and a well-understood environment that, while harsh, provides breathable air, natural gravity, and an atmosphere that retains heat and blocks the worst cosmic radiation. And yet no city exists in Antarctica. No one is born there with the intention of spending their life there. No one retires there. No one builds a private home. No economy operates there beyond the subsidized research enterprise. The population rotates entirely. Every resident is a temporary worker on assignment. Families remain on other continents. Supply chains run from New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and South Africa. If the supply ships and cargo flights stopped, every station on the continent would be evacuated within months. Antarctica is the best-case analogy for what the moon will become in the foreseeable future. And Antarctica is not a city. It is not close to a city. It is not on a trajectory toward becoming a city. 60 years of continuous human presence, with breathable air and normal gravity, and an environment orders of magnitude more hospitable than the lunar surface, has produced research stations, not cities. The lesson is not that Antarctica failed. The lesson is that the conditions required for urban permanence go far beyond the conditions required for operational presence. And if those conditions have not been met in Antarctica after 6 decades, they will not be met on the moon in any timeline that current planning addresses. This comparison is not meant to diminish the moon program. It is meant to calibrate expectations. What Artemis will achieve on the moon is roughly analogous to what the International Geophysical Year achieved in Antarctica in 1957 and 1958. The establishment of a coordinated international research presence in an extreme environment. That achievement was historic. It transformed our understanding of Earth's climate, geology, and ice sheet dynamics. It produced scientific discoveries that continue to shape global policy today. It was worth every dollar invested. And it did not produce a city, because producing a city was never the objective and the environment never supported it. The moon will follow a similar trajectory. Missions will come and go. Infrastructure will accumulate. Science will be conducted. Technology will be demonstrated. International cooperation will deepen. Commercial participation will grow. And through all of this, the moon will remain what it is: a workplace, a laboratory, a destination for the most highly trained and rigorously selected human beings on Earth, visiting on rotation, performing extraordinary work and returning home. Now, some will ask the honest follow-up question: is this permanent? Will the Artemis architecture endure, or will it follow the pattern of Apollo and be abandoned when political winds shift? This is a legitimate concern, and the honest answer is uncertain. The geopolitical competition with China provides a stronger and more durable justification than the Cold War rivalry that sustained Apollo. The commercial participation by SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other companies creates economic stakeholders with incentives to maintain the program beyond any single political administration. The international partnerships embedded in the Artemis framework distribute both the costs and the political ownership of the program across multiple nations, making unilateral cancellation more difficult. These structural features give Artemis greater resilience than Apollo had, but they do not guarantee permanence. No government program is permanent. The history of space exploration is littered with ambitious architectures that were designed, partially built, and then cancelled. The Constellation Program, the Space Exploration Initiative, the National Aerospace Plane, each was announced with confidence, funded with enthusiasm, and terminated when priorities changed. Artemis is more durable than its predecessors, but it is not invulnerable. What about the private sector? Could commercial companies succeed where government agencies cannot? This question is worth taking seriously, because the trajectory of commercial spaceflight over the past 2 decades has been genuinely remarkable. SpaceX has reduced the cost of reaching low Earth orbit by roughly a factor of 10 compared to legacy launch providers. Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, Relativity Space, and others are driving further cost reductions through competition and innovation. Starship, if it achieves its design goals, could reduce the cost of delivering payload to the lunar surface by another order of magnitude. These cost reductions are transformative. They change the economics of everything that happens in space. But cost reduction alone does not create a city. Cheaper access to the moon makes bases more affordable. It makes scientific missions more frequent. It makes technology demonstrations more practical. It makes commercial services like cargo delivery, crew transport, and surface logistics viable as businesses. All of this is valuable. All of this will happen. None of it creates the economic logic, the governance framework, the manufacturing self-sufficiency, or the biological knowledge required for permanent urban settlement. The commercial path to a lunar city, if it exists at all, would require something that has not yet happened: the discovery or creation of an economic activity on the moon that generates revenue exceeding the cost of operating there. This is the fundamental threshold. As long as everything on the moon costs more than it produces, the moon remains a subsidized outpost. The moment something on the moon generates net positive economic value, the calculus changes entirely. Capital flows toward profit. Where capital flows, infrastructure follows. Where infrastructure accumulates, people come. Where people come, communities form. This is the organic logic of urbanization that built every city in human history. But identifying what that economic activity could be remains an open question. Propellant production from lunar water ice, selling fuel to spacecraft in cislunar space, is the most commonly cited near-term candidate. If the cost of producing propellant on the moon and delivering it to lunar orbit is lower than the cost of launching equivalent propellant from Earth, a market exists. This is plausible in principle. Whether it is achievable in practice depends on the concentration and accessibility of water ice deposits, the reliability and efficiency of extraction technology, the cost of operating mining and processing equipment in the permanently shadowed regions, and the size of the market for cislunar propellant. All of these variables are currently unknown or poorly constrained. Propellant production may eventually create a viable lunar business. It is not a certainty, and even if it succeeds, a propellant depot is not a city. It is an industrial facility, an important one, a potentially transformative one, but not a community where people raise families and build lives. So what would actually be required for a true lunar city to exist? The honest answer is a list so long and so demanding that it reads less like an engineering specification and more like a description of a new civilization. It would require closed-loop life support systems with near-zero failure tolerance, capable of recycling air, water, and waste for decades without resupply. It would require food production at agricultural scale, inside sealed, pressurized environments, using artificial lighting, manufactured soil or hydroponic systems, and biological diversity sufficient to provide adequate nutrition for a permanent population, including children, pregnant women, the elderly, and the ill. It would require manufacturing capability sufficient to produce replacement components for every critical system without importing them from Earth, including pressure seals, electronics, medical devices, power system components, structural materials, and agricultural equipment. It would require energy production at a scale sufficient to power an entire urban infrastructure continuously, including through the 14-day lunar night, using nuclear fission or fusion reactors capable of operating for decades without major overhaul. It would require a population large enough to sustain genetic diversity, social institutions, and specialized expertise across multiple generations, probably thousands of people at minimum. It would require governance structures capable of making and enforcing laws, resolving disputes, collecting revenue, providing public services, and maintaining order independently of any Earth-based authority. It would require medical infrastructure capable of handling the full spectrum of human health needs, including obstetrics, pediatrics, geriatrics, surgery, psychiatric care, and emergency medicine. It would require educational institutions capable of training the next generation of residents in the skills necessary to maintain and operate every system the city depends on. It would require verified empirical data confirming that human beings can live, develop, reproduce, and age in 1/6 gravity without catastrophic health consequences. And it would require multi-generational commitment from a political or economic entity willing to sustain investment across decades before any return is realized. This list is not intended to be discouraging. It is intended to be precise, because precision is the antidote to the vague optimism that has dominated the public conversation about lunar settlement for decades. Vague optimism produces disappointment. Precise understanding produces achievable goals. And the achievable goals for the moon in the coming decades are genuinely magnificent, even if they do not include a city. Here is what the next 30 years of lunar development can realistically achieve. A permanently staffed research outpost at the South Pole, comparable in function to McMurdo Station, with rotating crews of 8 to 20 people. Demonstrated extraction of water ice from permanently shadowed regions. Demonstrated production of oxygen from lunar regolith, demonstrated construction of radiation-shielded structures using sintered regolith, commercial cargo delivery services operating on a regular schedule, international scientific collaboration, producing transformative discoveries about the moon's geology, the history of the inner solar system, and the behavior of volatiles in permanently shadowed craters, astronomical observatories on the lunar far side, shielded from Earth's radio noise, capable of detecting signals that no terrestrial or orbital telescope can access. Technology demonstrations for closed-loop life support, agricultural systems, and manufacturing processes that will inform future plans for deeper space exploration and, eventually, for permanent settlement. Every one of these achievements would be historic. Every one would advance human capability in ways that matter far beyond the moon itself. The technologies developed for lunar operations, life support recycling, radiation shielding, dust mitigation, autonomous construction, resource extraction, will have applications on Earth and in space for centuries. The science conducted at the lunar South Pole will rewrite textbooks. The international partnerships forged through Artemis will establish precedents for cooperation in space that influence geopolitics on Earth. Consider what the South Pole specifically offers as a scientific destination. The permanently shadowed craters near Shackleton and de Gerlache have not seen sunlight for over 2 billion years. Their floors are among the coldest naturally occurring surfaces in the solar system. Any volatile compounds delivered to these craters by cometary impacts or solar wind implantation over geological time have been preserved in a deep freeze that no terrestrial laboratory can replicate. Analyzing the composition of these deposits would provide a direct chemical record of the inner solar system's bombardment history, answering questions about where Earth's water came from and how organic molecules were distributed across the young solar system. The regolith layers across the south polar region preserve a stratigraphic record of micrometeorite flux, solar wind intensity, and galactic cosmic ray exposure, stretching back billions of years. Reading that record would reconstruct the space environment that shaped the early Earth during the period when life first emerged. The lunar far side, permanently shielded from Earth's radio frequency emissions, offers the only location in the inner solar system where low-frequency radio astronomy can be conducted without interference. A radio telescope array on the far side could detect signals from the cosmic dark ages, the era before the first stars ignited, opening an entirely new window on the early universe that no terrestrial or orbital observatory can access. These are not incremental additions to existing knowledge. They are discoveries that could reshape our understanding of planetary formation, the origins of life, and the structure of the early cosmos. The moon does not need to become a city to justify its place in human civilization. It needs to become exactly what it is becoming, a laboratory without equal. But none of this is a city, and that is the conclusion this story has been building toward, not as a verdict of failure, as a clarification of categories. NASA can return humans to the moon. NASA is returning humans to the moon. NASA can build infrastructure on the moon that persists and grows across decades. NASA can help establish a research presence that transforms our understanding of the solar system. These things are real. These things are happening. These things deserve support, funding, and public enthusiasm. What NASA cannot do, what no space agency can do, what no government on Earth is currently structured to do, is build a true self-sustaining city on the moon. The physical barriers are too severe. The institutional frameworks are too narrow. The economic logic does not exist. The biological knowledge is too incomplete. The governance structures have not been invented. The manufacturing self-sufficiency has not been imagined in any serious engineering roadmap. The cost is beyond anything any political system has ever committed to a single project. And the timeline, if such a thing is even possible, is measured in generations, not administrations. The moon may host missions, bases, laboratories, observatories, mining operations, fuel depots, and research stations long before it ever hosts anything that deserves to be called a city. And the distance between those things and a city is not a gap that closes naturally with time. It is a gap that closes only when humanity develops capabilities it does not currently possess. Capabilities in biology, in manufacturing, in governance, in economics, and in the fundamental willingness to commit resources across generations to a project whose benefits accrue to people not yet born. There is a profound honesty in accepting this. It does not diminish the moon, it does not diminish NASA, it does not diminish the dream. What it does is strip away the comfortable illusion that building a city on another world is simply a matter of scaling up what we already know how to do. It is not. It is a civilizational challenge of a kind humanity has never faced, and meeting it will require not just better rockets and stronger habitats, but a transformation in how human societies organize themselves, fund long-term projects, govern shared spaces, and think about obligations to the future. Perhaps the most important thing the Artemis program will accomplish is not what it builds on the moon, but what it teaches us about ourselves. Every mission that fails to meet its timeline teaches us about the limits of institutional planning. Every cost overrun teaches us about the true price of operating in space. Every technology demonstration teaches us what works and what does not. Every crew rotation teaches us about the human capacity to endure isolation and hardship. And every gap between what we promise and what we deliver teaches us about the distance between aspiration and reality. That distance is not a void. It is a curriculum, And the students are not just astronauts and engineers. They are the policymakers who must fund the work, the citizens who must support it, and the generations who will inherit whatever we build or fail to build in the decades ahead. The moon is not going to become a city in our lifetimes, but it is going to become something real, something valuable, something that no generation before ours has had the technology to create. A human foothold on another world, modest in scale, dependent on Earth, fragile in ways that cities are not, but present, functioning, inhabited by human beings doing extraordinary work in an extraordinary place. And from that foothold, if we are honest about what it is and what it is not, the next generation can begin the real work. Not the work of exploration, the work of settlement, the work of building the industries, the institutions, the technologies, and the biological knowledge that a city requires. That work will be harder than anything Artemis attempts. It will take longer, it will cost more, it will demand more of humanity than any project in our species' history. But it starts with honesty. It starts with seeing the moon clearly, not as a canvas for projection, but as a world with its own physics, its own constraints, and its own terrible beauty. It starts with understanding that reopening the moon is not the same as urbanizing it, that visiting is not living, that surviving is not thriving, that a base, no matter how permanent its name, is not a city. NASA will go back to the moon. Astronauts will walk on the South Pole. Infrastructure will be built that endures. Science will be conducted that reshapes human knowledge. And all of it will happen on a world that remains, for now and for the foreseeable future, the most magnificent desolation within human reach. A place we can work, a place we can study, a place we can admire, but not yet a place we can call home. The city will come, or it will not. But if it comes, it will be built by a civilization that understood the difference between dreaming and building, between arriving and belonging, between planting a flag and planting a future. And the first step toward that civilization is the one we are taking now, not onto the lunar surface, into the honest recognition of how far we still have to go.